talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is episode number 32. I'm here with Jim. My name is Jeff. This is the podcast where we talk about all things identity and access management, and then maybe some other things as well. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you, Jeff?
I'm pretty good. It's a Friday afternoon. It's kind of the last thing I need to do other than edit this out for the week. So we're recording this one a little bit early because I know you and I are both traveling next week, and we're trying to get ahead of the game, so to speak. But through the wonderful world of the magic of internet, hopefully we'll have this out, according to our normal kind of schedule or weekly schedule.
Well, we just have to be thankful that Al Gore invented the internet when he did, and it's had all this time to mature, and it's where it is today.
Well, and pants. I'm very happy about that. So, I mean,
yeah, we do kind of need those.
Right. Yeah. So, internet and pants. Good job, Al Gore. So, what do you want to talk through this week? I think kind of we're thinking maybe like confusing or misleading terms that we come across in the identity and access management space. How's that sound?
Right. I think it sounds great. So we were on a call earlier today, and this is what got me really thinking that this might be an interesting topic to discuss. And it might not be in this podcast, will really stink. But the term I threw out there was to talk about internal versus external applications. And someone asked the question, well, what do you mean by internal versus external? And so what I was talking about was the user population, the primary user of an application. So I was thinking like, the HR system would be an internal application because all the users of the HR system are either employees or contractors or people who kind of are part of the workforce. An external application I meant as, one of their web applications that their customers or their members would go and use this application. That was an external application, even though employees would also log in to do administrative tasks. The primary user were external people. So to me, that was an external application in my mind. Well, another person from the company chimed in and said, well, we've been talking about internal applications are applications that we manage internally. So it's something that, like a internal SharePoint server or maybe something that we built for managing even those web applications I talked about where the primary users are external people. That would be considered an internal application because it was built and is managed internally versus something like Salesforce or Workday, something like that. He was saying that would be an external application because it's managed by an external company. And I thought, wow, that is two totally different ways of looking at it. And, the one definition doesn't fit with the other definition at all.
So I'm going to throw a wrench into internal, external. What about an application that is both? I'm thinking of Microsoft Teams.
Yeah.
So Teams, right? You can use it internally and it has its own file structure, which is based on SharePoint, but you can also invite external people into it. How would you classify that?
Well, we asked another question. Can you host it internally like you can with SharePoint?
No, I believe Teams is a cloud product.
But you could use SharePoint as that example. I mean, that would totally mind blown. So my my
That's
definition,
what I'm here for, Jim.
yeah. Thank you. My definition would have primarily come from the standpoint of, I guess the way I would address that question would be, okay, well, what are people logging into Teams with? Is it like a corporate Active Directory account, or are they using external accounts? And I think Teams is not even a straightforward answer, right? Because if you create a Teams application or Teams site for people to collaborate with from another company, can they use their own corporate identity to log in? Or
if they've got federated, yeah, they're going through Microsoft. That's how it works.
Yeah. So
I mean, we use Teams quite a bit for some of the work that we do And, I think we're starting to get into the process of hosting teams, whereas I think traditionally we've kind of joined other organizations' teams as part of projects.
Right.
But we log in with our Microsoft credential.
Yeah. So I don't have a, I'm having a hard time coming up with the answer, but I think the answer would be it would be internal because you're using it to kind of run the operations of your own company versus, you know, kind of the strict purpose of the application being to interface with your external parties.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's probably the best I can come up with. What do you think? I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah. So here's what I think. I don't care. It doesn't matter. I think as long as the definition is agreed to by whoever's in charge of it, because I could see different organizations calling it internal or external, or maybe even just a separate category called SaaS, right? Software as a service. I don't think it necessarily matters as long as everyone is operating on the same definition. So whoever the IAM program or core project team, et cetera, as long as they all understand kind of where it fits, I don't necessarily think it needs to have a hard and fast definition.
I think that's probably going to be a good rule of thumb for a lot of these terms that we came up with, because you ultimately have to decide what is your definition, get everybody on the same page in terms of your definition, and then move on and not just fight those semantics forever.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a fan of keeping it simple. And I think you could spend way too much time solving problems that don't matter. And I think that's one. Just agree on a definition up front or make it known and move on. There's other things to work on.
Right.
What about roles?
I think they're great for sandwiches.
Yeah, I like them too. A nice pretzel roll. Oof.
Yeah. Or Kaiser roll.
Kaiser roll, yeah. Really, maybe some Italian roll. That'd be great.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure everybody who's listening to this podcast has run
for the
into.
comedy as much as they are the IAM, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that probably a bunch of people hit stop after we just did that. But no, I mean, the term roles seems like it becomes a debate almost constantly in terms of what does it actually mean. In my early days in IAM consulting, I kind of like to think of roles in terms of they were containers of several different entitlements or permissions or groups, and they were more or less they had to um, wrap up some kind of lower level of what I'll call an entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought of those entitlements is like being fed from applications. Here are um, the entitlements that we have as available to our users, and then a role would kind of be able to bundle that up to say, all right, you're coming into my organization as a clerk, and a clerk should get the clerk role, and that would mean you can do X, Y, and Z on this application, ABC on that application, DEF on that application. And then what I realized was that most of the applications actually use the term roles to talk about what I was calling entitlements. So, you'd wind up collecting from each of those applications a series of roles. What I find that, is you have to have a very open mind and a very, be willing when you're working with a new organization to understand how they use the term roles. And if you kind of go into one of these consulting engagements with a very fixed idea of like a role means exactly this, it's usually because you're talking about a specific vendor product and how they define roles. So an IT role is this, a business role is that. And that's fine. I mean, if you're a specialist in a product, you definitely want to understand what that vendor, how they use that nomenclature. At the same time, if you do kind of what we do, or you're going into a new organization as a IAM program manager, or you switch jobs or whatever, you better be flexible, because that term gets used differently in many different places.
Yeah. I remember early on in my career describing a role as a bundle of entitlements. Um, and I think this is one of those things where sometimes it's easier to just whiteboard it out. Say, okay, here's what we're trying to build, right? And then let's try to map where the different components are, because applications will have different things, right? They might call it permissions or entitlements or groups or roles, right? Or whatever it may be. And then you have and those are application constructs. And then you have the kind of the IAM construct of a role, right? Or a group, which could be either thing. And then you have the business construct of a role, which could be an HR role, right? Or an IT role, or, maybe even the role of an employee, even though we might consider that a type of identity. There might be a role of employee or contractor or something along those lines too. So again, another one where decide on what your nomenclature is going to be, and then make sure that everyone's operating on the same wavelength.
We're working with a client that uses SailPoint IAQ, and they have a very extensive role catalog. And one of the things that we were talking about was, essentially one of the a role would be X, Y, and Z entitlements. So if a person had those X, Y, and Z entitlements, either because they were assigned the role or they got those entitlements by hook or by crook, individually or inherited because of other roles, they were put in that role, and it may or may not make sense. So what they were actually the solution they had come up with was, if we want to have a role mean X, Y, and Z, and strictly that you got that role because you were assigned that role, they give them X, Y, and Z, and then they would come up with kind of a fake entitlement to add to that role. It wouldn't actually give you permission to anything, but it would ensure that you wouldn't have gotten that fake entitlement any other way than by being assigned that role. I thought that was ingenious, really helped them in terms of their access review processes and things. But really, the reason I brought that up is that there's another definition of a role. It's like you have these entitlements that equate to that role, so you're in that role. And I'm like, I don't know, that doesn't compute for me. I like to think of a role as like, I guess I'm kind of a top-down person, and that is one of the big things to know about roles is they can either be developed from top down or from bottom up. You can kind of say, well, people who work in HR, 90% of them have these 7 entitlements or groups or roles, whatever you want to call them. So there should be a new role created that basically all HR people get this role. And so that's kind of the role mining. That's the bottom up role exercise. The top down role would be that we say, hey, we want to just simplify the onboarding process for people as they come in to work here. And we start saying, all right, HR is a department. What do all HR people need when they start work here? And it's going to be these 6 or 7 things, these applications and these roles within these applications. And we can either use birthright, and it's kind of what did we have somebody say to us that was a term of art, birthright? That's pretty much that is as much of an IAM industry term as I've heard. I mean, I've been hearing birthright since I got involved with IAM. But birthright access means that based on an attribute, usually coming from an authoritative source about you, that if you have that attribute, you should be automatically assigned that role. If you lose that attribute, that role should be taken away from you. So in other words, if my department is HR, I should get the HR role. If I move and my department is now accounting, the HR role should be taken away from me. And if there are accounting roles that depend on just, if their criteria for assignment is that I'm a member of, or that's my department, then I should get those roles. That's birthright. The other is requestable. This would be something like, there's not really anything on that profile that we want to automatically assign the role, we want it to go through somebody physically assigning it. Maybe we want it to go through an approval process, and this might be a role specific to using a certain application. It might be a series of applications, but it might be something like I am a benefits administrator. So I have the benefits administrator role, and maybe that's not my title, but maybe I'm the backup benefits administrator. So I need to get that role anyway. That's something where we might say that would be requestable, would go through an approval process, and get provisioned.
I see like just a maze. If like people try to figure out like, okay, which way are we going with this or that one. So I think we beat roles to death there a little bit. So let's move maybe to privileged access management. What do you consider privileged access?
Yeah, I mean that's a question we get a lot. Is we start talking about privileged access, and somebody in the audience or in the group from our client will ask, "Well, what is privileged access?" And I tend to say, I want to say, it depends on what you want it to be. There are certain things I think are clearly in. Privilege would be things like domain admins, the group within Active Directory. I mean, those are the most powerful accounts. But then it can be beyond that. It could be power users. It could be groups that you define within your organization. And then outside of Active Directory, it could be individual accounts within applications, databases, at the operating system level, Unix accounts, things like that. That your organization has defined as privileged. If you're in a large organization or heavily regulated organization, I would want to involve my risk partners to help define what are the groups or roles that we consider to be privileged, and then the accounts that have those roles would be privileged accounts.
What about um, social media accounts?
It's a tough one, because I think traditional methods for managing privileged access um, can potentially fall short. So we were working with a specific client where you know they have social media accounts where they want to be able to take a picture from an event and get that out to Twitter or out to Instagram within minutes of it happening, right? And so traditional check in, check out of a password to log into that platform isn't something that is going to be feasible. Now, I do believe there are technology solutions. I know you're pretty up to date on some of these, but I do think that the risk posed by social media accounts, especially for certain organizations, is there's potentially a big hit to the brand equity if somebody were to take that social media account and use it for bad. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that's pretty much what I'm thinking of is it's not a traditional privileged access management, thing, but in my mind it's just as important as someone who has domain admin as the person who can go onto your Facebook account and put stuff that you don't want there, right? And you hear it from time to time. Someone posts something that they shouldn't have on the company social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, Instagram, etc. So there are products specifically, I think, that do a better job at managing that. I don't have any kind of preference in there. The one that I can think of right off the top of my head would be Hootsuite. They're more of like a social media management kind of suite of software. I think that works better than something more traditional like a CyberArk, for example, which is more focused on infrastructure within the enterprise. You talk about pictures, and I kind of see this a little bit because of some of the work that my wife does, where they typically will share an Instagram account, the password, and multiple people may be posting things for events and things that they're being run, or they may have one person kind of collect all the pictures get them texted to them in real time, and then one person's responsible for posting those, to the official brand accounts, those sorts of things. So it can work a few different ways, but I think ultimately what you're trying to do is mitigate risk, and that is the risk of brand, reputation, those sorts of things that can happen if the wrong information is put out onto the social media. So something to consider from a privileged access management spot. I'm not going to recommend, throw them in your traditional privileged access management technology, but consider it as part of your program and how those are governed and managed. And then if you're really heavy into it, some organizations have a really heavy social media presence, consider investing in dedicated tools in that space just to mitigate the risk, more effectively than maybe just a policy or a procedure.
Yeah, I think that's a good framework.
Mm-hmm. So how about SSO, single sign-on versus simplified sign-on?
Yeah, I think that this gets, the reason I wanted to talk about this one is that we'll talk about SSO and a client would say, well, we have SSO. And what they're really talking about is simplified sign-on. And your mind goes right to single sign-on. So quick definition, single sign-on is when if you have multiple applications, you authenticate once and your session carries with you so that you don't have to re-authenticate for each application that you go to. Simplified sign-on just means that your credentials, username and password, is the same for each application. So as you go from application A to application B, you'd have to re-authenticate, and you authenticate in A, you'd have to re-authenticate in B, go over to C, you've re-authenticated, same username and password, but not single sign-on. Single sign-on means that your session and all of the policies, for example, carry from point A to point B. Why this is really important to me is that where we're going with things is that we keep talking about this. So this is something they said at Gartner this year, and I agree with it 100%, is that the new standard is MFA everywhere. Now, does that mean that you have to use a second factor everywhere you go? No. It means that if you have a single sign-on system and you have application A, B, and C, again, using single sign-on, you might get prompted for MFA when you establish that session. Then as you go from app to app, you're still in that session that already used MFA. Now you may have policies that when you get to application C, there's such a risky application that you have to do something to step up your authentication, maybe do MFA again. That's a separate story. Now, if you're in a simplified sign-on environment, to achieve MFA everywhere, it would be laborious because you'd have to implement MFA at each individual application, which is usually just not going to happen. So this is more of an impetus around why organizations need to get to single sign-on, not simplified sign-on.
And the simplified sign-on too is you probably have to synchronize passwords to different applications, which means potentially passwords going out in the clear, even just out on your own network, which I don't know of any CISO that would be thrilled about that. So,
yeah.
I used to call it quasi single sign-on probably 10, 15 years ago when I was kind of tackling this and trying to figure out how to make things easier before single sign-on came around. And that was basically make the password the same make the user ID and the password ID the same across different systems. And then the trick would be, how do you keep those passwords in sync? So I think a lot of early on in kind of the IGA space, there were a lot of password synchronization tricks and plugins and tools and things like that. And I think those have kind of died out in favor of shifting password management more to a single sign-on type approach, and leveraging, that which is more secure and it's more user-friendly too, and less of a pain for, IAM administrators to try and manage.
Yeah. I think when you have just the username the same across apps and the password can get us, you have nothing. You have a policy that everybody use a certain user ID format. In terms of kind of simplified sign-on, I think, where I see a lot of organizations pushing back is they say, all right, we've got all of these applications pointing to the same Active Directory. So the person has to log in with Active Directory. We apply all the Active Directory policies, so we authenticate people that way. But if we go back to passwords suck, they're not good enough, right? They're not a good enough security mechanism because people reuse passwords. They, rather than really using complex passwords, they give something they can remember. And if you want to get to MFA everywhere, which this isn't just Jim saying it, this is Gartner's now saying it, and really, I don't think they're breaking any new ground by saying it either. If you want to get to MFA everywhere, really the only scalable solution is to have a single sign-on implementation. I think some people will criticize single sign-on and say, well, okay, so a big deal. Our users have to authenticate multiple times when they go to each application. They don't really do that much. It's not just that. It's the entire security layer that you layer on top of all of these applications. That's really where you get the benefit of single sign-on versus simplified sign-on.
Yeah. So you've mentioned MFA a couple times as we're having a conversation, and sometimes that can be confusing as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that people are looking for sometimes the lowest common denominator MFA, especially when you're talking about internal workforce use cases. They'll say, all right, well, can't we just ask people an additional question? Like, in other words, I log in and then it asks me my mother's maiden name. That is not multi-factor authentication. So just kind of to go back to the textbook definition, there are three forms of authentication. It's something you know, something you have, or something you are. And something you are is biometric. Something you have is usually your phone. Something you know is your username and password, to kind of move it to something that everybody can understand. Having two of the same factor, like something you know and something you know, is not multi-factor authentication. And it's not quite as secure, because the idea is that if you were to say, all right, my username and password are X and Y, and then I'm going to put in my mother's maiden name, all that is just data that could be dumped out to the dark web, right? Or it could be pieced together by looking at my Facebook profile, things like that. So it doesn't achieve the minimal bar for what is multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of KBA, knowledge-based authentication, anymore. I mean, I understand the relevance of it, a decade ago when there weren't these other technologies available or as ubiquitous. But the other thing I see still today, companies making with that sort of authentication or as a step-up authentication, and I'm going to pick on United Airlines because I can, because I have to answer these questions all the time. They use knowledge-based authentication for a second factor when you log into your account. So I constantly see these because I'm always using different devices as I test things out. And they use a bank of questions where they are favorites. Favorites change over time. So my favorite color, for example, which isn't a real question, might be, blue today, red tomorrow, purple the next day. That's a terrible, user experience when you don't know. And I see that all the time where, what is your favorite so-and-so? And that's used as one of the KBA questions. And it drives me crazy when I see that because of that simple fact. And then you've got these other ones where they're kind of loosely based, like, what did you want to be when you grow up? And there's a static list of things to pick from. And the list might not be long enough to really make it worthwhile. So if you know even the slightest thing about, an individual, you might be able to guess it. So I'm going to call out United because I think that their step-up authentication is not great, and they should make that better.
You should start flying somebody else.
Well, I live in the Chicago area, so
so no.
The nice thing about United, in their defense, is I can pretty much get anywhere without having to take a connection, which is super convenient. But the security that they're using for their customer accounts, Mileage Plus, I think could be better with regards to the second factor side of things.
Absolutely, and I think that I think what winds up happening is that somewhere along the way, someone had the bright idea that let's institute these questions to do step up so that we're not going to let somebody who had their password compromised have their address changed or something like that without getting a little bit more information. And then they went and collected all this information about people for a decade, and now it's like everybody realized like that was a terrible idea, but it's so hard to change it now. We have to
Yeah.
reach out to everybody and get, but I mean, I think it's our responsibility to. I mean, it's at this point, it's 2020. You've got a lot of cell phones. You've got a lot of email addresses. Like, start moving to something better.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing, and I'm going to just pick on United again. This is a relatively new development for them. This is only a system that's like 2 years old, I think. So even within the last 2 years, KBA has not been recommended by any kind of serious IAM individual. And yet they still rolled it out only just a couple years ago. So I don't anticipate that they're going to make any change relatively soon to replace that. They might add some other options, but United, what are you doing?
Yeah. Ooh.
All right. How
Look,
about for a last one for the week, MDM? What does MDM mean
MDM.
to you?
So I think it means mobile, or not mobile device management. I think it means master data management.
So I'm the opposite. I think of mobile device management first, and then I think of master data management.
What do you think? Most people think.
I don't know because I would have thought it would have been mobile device management, but I think it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking maybe on the security side of things, maybe mobile device. But if you're not in security and you're more of like architect or marketing or maybe even HR, you're probably thinking master data management instead. And they're two very obviously completely different things, but both are rooted somewhere in IAM as conversations come up.
I think mobile device management definitely is very important in terms of corporate data security and being able to create what they call an enclave on a person's personal device. So if somebody wants to do corporate activities on their personal phone, having this enclave that can be wiped remotely without wiping a person's personal phone and kind of keeping business at least having a virtual air gap between the two, I think I think it's a necessary technology. Kind of feels like it's become more infrastructure than strategic. When I think of master data management, I think that you start getting into, well, I think like let's kind of start with what master data management and that what it does and what that market is really focused on. And I think the market's focused on primarily being able to take data from multiple sources and feed it to a CRM system. So the kind of classic example in my mind, anyway, for what MDM would do is, let's say you're a company and you have booths at trade shows where people can fill out a paper card, or they can go onto a website and they can register for a contest. Another thing is they could sign up for a loyalty program, or potentially like apply for a mortgage or whatever kind of products you have. And then now you have Jim McDonald, who went to the conference and filled out to win a car, and I went online to uh, to get access to a white paper, and I also applied for a financial product online. How do you know that Jim McDonald in those three different scenarios is the same person? And the MDM solution allows you to define uh, correlation rules. So you can say, all right, well, if the address is the same, or kind of fuzzy logic, address is the same, and the email address is the same, then it's a match. If the address is different, or if the name is spelled differently, but we and so usually what it does is it uses some kind of numeric. If you achieve a certain numeric match, then merge them into the same person. And so that's great for CRM because usually in a CRM kind of capacity is like, okay, now Jim, we're starting to see a pattern. He went to this conference and he went online, did this, and he signed up for the loyalty program. And we think he would be somebody that we should call and tell him that, we're running a special. That's great for CRM. But when it comes to access management, identity and access management, if that fuzzy logic is wrong and we merged the wrong Jim McDonald from these various zones and then said, hey, you have access to HR data or something like that, or even less than HR data, that's just too much of a mistake. So really, I think that master data management, feeding data for purposes of customer retention is one thing, but using it for identity access management is another. At the same time, because MDM has these correlation and you can get very specific in terms of the correlation. So if email address is the same and you have 10 different systems and they all have email address, it's going to be 100% match or it's not going to be. You can get it so that that fuzzy logic is very tight. So you're very confident that the data you brought from multiple systems is the same person. Now you can merge it and create like a master profile. That's a lot of what IGA does as well. IGA can pull accounts and entitlements from various applications, as well as attributes about that person that are stored on their profile, and merge it all into one and use business rules to determine we're going to keep phone number from this system over this system over that system. And where I think MDM can really come into play is if you have a very large number of attributes, or you have you have multiple purposes for this data, not just IAM, but also to feed other systems. Otherwise, I think if you have IGA and MDM, you'd want to use IGA to be able to correlate this data. I think the other thing is if you're not really in an IGA type of scenario. So to me, IGA scenarios are best for employee type of situations. So it's you're going to use IGA to manage your workforce applications. When you're talking about your externally facing applications, that's generally not a good IGA scenario. And so using an MDM as part of an infrastructure to be able to pull, kind of all the authorization information and profile attribute information from, you have a large number of web applications to build kind of a common user profile, that is a scenario that could make a lot of sense. That data could either then be exposed via APIs, it could be synced back, so you could be getting a phone number from application A and syncing it back to application B. That's a potential scenario. You could be using some of that profile data as data that gets passed to applications at the time of authentication. So I could see how an MDM could fit into an architecture, especially a customer IAM scenario. It would make sense.
Yeah, I would be concerned about using an MDM for authentication or authorization decisions, because I feel like you're building a house on top of another house potentially, which might be built on another house. So how do you keep those things in sync and have them synchronized in a timely manner that makes sense, where you're not granting access to something that someone may not have access to anymore? Maybe milliseconds, or it could be seconds, or even a day, right? If you sync identity attributes, or I'm sorry, authorization attributes into your IGA platform daily, and that data then syncs somewhere above it into some sort of MDM, you're theoretically already at least a day behind from a authorization standpoint. So I think you have to be careful about how you would use an MDM in that space. But I definitely agree at the identity level, attributes around who the individual is, name, phone number, address, things like that makes a lot of sense. Or even in cases where you're managing things that are not human, right? Internet of Things, bots, those sorts of things. and MDM might be helpful. Master data management, I should say, would be helpful managing those types of identities as well.
Right. I think that you bring up a really good point, which is, synchronizing data has definitely drawbacks. And, when I am working on an architecture, is one of the things that I try to avoid is synchronizing data. Sometimes it's usually a trade-off. It's either between synchronizing data and exposing the data via APIs and potentially making that an operationally required system. So, for example, let's just say that you use the MDM to pull data from 50 different data sources, and now you have a profile of 500 attributes. And you say, well, we don't want to keep those 500 attributes in sync with our access management data repository. So say you have a cloud IDP and you don't want to keep, 1,000,000 people and 500 attributes in sync across the cloud. So you say, well, let's open up an API. The problem with opening up an API is that now that MDM system would be operationally required. So if you have authentication, then point to API and pulling attributes out from that master profile. If that API is not available, what's going to happen? Well, you'd have to design your authentication process to be resilient. If it's not there, the process is going to work. You're going to be able to authenticate anyway. But usually what people are looking for is their access management system to be highly available, say 5 nines, basically on all the time. And if your MDM system or whatever APIs you create as part of the authentication process aren't available at that same level, then you're going to have some lower service level availability. My suggestion would be to, if you have to do that, try to build some resiliency so that the APIs are not available or they're responding too slow. You can use cache data from the last authentication. And I think I've seen with a lot of access management products where they have that capability to go back into kind of the last successful authentication attempt and use the data from that authentication if the API is not available. So that can help mitigate the risk of using a non-operational system in an operational way. But even if you have that mitigation in place, you got to think about volume. If you're having a 1,000,000 logins a day, do you want each one of those logins to have to go back to your MDM and pull profile data? The alternative might be that you have to sync the data, which is, choose the lesser of both evils, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I think it comes down to using the right tool for the job, right? You can use a screwdriver as a hammer. Not the best tool, might work. And I think you just have to be careful about planning between where you're going to store your information, no matter what it is, whether it's identity or entitlement or account information, between master data, between an HR, source of truth, and an IGA platform, and even directories associated with an access management platform. Try not to get into a situation where you're using the wrong tool for some of the work that might need to go into making it work the way that you're trying to work. All right, I think we beat MDM to death. I think we can probably call it for this week. Anything else that you want to bring up, Jim?
Just the confusion. One other confusion I run into sometime, comedy hour time, it's workday, and people get that confused with Miller time. And it's late on Friday, Jeff. Obviously, you've confused Miller time with workday because we're still working and it's Miller time. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Well, I'm trying to wrap it up, and you just keep talking and talking and talking.
That's what I do best, I guess.
All right. Well, let's end the workday on that note and the work week, and call it for this week. Appreciate everyone listening. If you want to get a hold of us, you can find us at identityatthecenter.com, or you can email us at questions@identityatthecenter.com, and we'll be talking to y'all in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.